Gilmer with me.
Well, thank you, Arnie. Thank you very much.
The first question I have to ask you has been bugging me for probably since Sugar Shack came out. You did an interview, or you did a show in Pittsburgh, I think it was Clark Grace, and he asked you a question, and I don't remember the answer that you gave, and it's been driving me crazy. What does it mean when you put on some trash?
I was hoping nobody would bring that up again. It's just a slang for slang. That's really all it is. It's just a bunch of garbage. You know what comes out of people's mouths when they don't really know what they're saying and all that, and that's really pretty much all it is. It's just a bunch of junk.
Okay, because I've had people ask me that question, and I have no clue. I know I believe it was Clark Grace, you asked you the question, and I just didn't remember what...
Yeah, I've been asked that question before. That's one of them that comes up quite often, and there really isn't an answer for it. I didn't write the song, so I don't, and I never really had the opportunity to talk to who wrote it and to discuss that with him. But my understanding of it as I sang it is just like, hey, baby, here comes I'm going to put on the good trash, I love you, that kind of stuff.
Okay, well, at least you got that cleared up for me.
Oh, good.
All right. Jim, how long have you been with the Fireballs, or when did you join the Fireballs?
I joined the Fireballs in 1960, the summer of 1960, and we were together as a group. We had one drummer change during the next 10 years, pretty much the 60s, from the summer of 1960 to New Year's Eve of 1970, because I had given the band about a 6-month notice that I was going to be leaving at the end of the year. So it was almost a 10-year run.
Okay, now before you joined them, were you doing session work or background vocals for Norman Petty?
No, neither. I mean, I had met Norman and knew Norman, and I had a record deal that he'd gotten for me, but I didn't ever do any work for him. But I had a little combo there in Amarillo, Texas, and used to play around, in that about 100, 200-mile radius, everything from bars to strip joints to high schools to whatever, just like everybody else did during that period in that area too, because West Texas was kind of a hotbed there, or it was just starting because of Norman Petty and Buddy Holly and Buddy Knox and others.
Now, did you do any of the work on the remakes of any of the Holly music?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was involved in pretty much every bit of that. Played guitar, played second guitar, and I didn't do any singing or anything like that, but I was part of the band that put those tracks around the vocals that we had.
And we're talking about the apartment tape, or the apartment tapes that were discovered after Buddy's plane crash?
Yes, yeah.
It's hard to believe that we're coming up on 57 years next on Tuesday for that.
Well, I know it. I know. But I keep, at my age, Arnie, I'm reminded of things like this every day.
Oh, I'm sure. Okay, well, let's go back. How did you happen to get involved with the Fireballs?
Well, like I said, I had my own local band and was playing around, and I had gone. The drummer that I was using at that time was the drummer that Norman Petty was using in his trio. He had the Norman Petty trio, and they got out and played in that area. And so he talked me into coming over and meeting him, and I went over and met Norman, and we talked about recording, and a lot of other aspiring artists were doing kind of the same thing. And so we just kind of struck up a deal, and I went and paid to have a couple of sides recorded. And Norman went to New York and placed them, and I had a record on Decca, and I don't know. It obviously was never a big hit, but in a few markets in that area, it did quite well. And that was my start. Was my association with Norman was through an early recording, and then at a later time, over at the studio, just maybe getting ready to do something else, I met the Fireballs when they were in town at the studios. This is Clovis, New Mexico, I'm talking about. I met the guys one time when they were in town recording, and we just kind of struck up, a relationship, and consequently we bumped into each other a few more times in a similar situation, and so that was my connection with them. And then when their lead singer at that time had told them he was leaving and they had a tour coming up, my name just kind of came up, probably from Norman, who said, we need to find a lead singer, and my name was mentioned, so they called me, and I kind of went over and did an interview with them. The guys kind of just interviewed me, and we talked about what I liked to do, what I didn't like to do, what I liked to sing, didn't like to sing, that kind of stuff. And at the end of a long story, they said, well, we'd like for you to join the band and be our lead singer, and that's how fast it happened.
Well, originally, the Fireballs were more of an instrumental group. I mean, I know that they had done a couple vocals, but their big hits were all basically instrumentals. Is that correct?
That's correct. They were, at the same time, Chuck Tharp was the lead singer at that time. He was recording vocals, and it was kind of, one side was an instrumental and the other side was a vocal. But the Fireballs, right, their recording success in the beginning was all the instrumentals. There never was a vocal. And actually it wasn't a vocal hit until Sugar Shack came, which was good night, almost 3 years later, I guess.
Well, most people don't realize how big of an influence the Fireballs had on the surf music sound with the guitar instrumental picks or licks, so to speak. Mm-hmm. According to a lot of the research that I've done, the Fireballs' adaptation were used basically as an influence in the California surf music. Have you ever heard that?
Yeah, I have. And George Tomstow, who is the lead guitar player and wrote all the instrumentals, he still goes out and performs by himself, much like I kind of do myself now, as Jimmy Gilmer of the Fireballs. So he does the instrumental kind of thing and does it up. Actually, he goes over to Europe and is quite successful at that.
Okay, take us back to 1963. First of all, how did you get onto the Dot label?
Well, we cut a song. We had a session. We'd been on the road. I joined the Fireballs, and we immediately moved to Minneapolis. And we worked out of there. The promoter and the booking agent were out of Minneapolis. And so I was constantly touring that Midwest area. But, we say we were an instrumental group, but the majority of the songs we did on a given night were vocals. It's just that the instrumentals were the ones that caught on and sold. So I was the front. I was the lead singer in the front, and, we went and played all those ballrooms and everything that are all throughout the Midwest and had been doing that for several years. And one time we were back home, and I was gathering some songs up because, meanwhile, I was still trying to pursue a vocal career. And I'd put out a few records, and none of them really ever happened. but I got this last batch that I'd gotten. There was a song in there called Sugar Shack. And what we used to do back in those days is we'd work up a handful of songs, say a half a dozen, that we really like, and we would incorporate them into our show because we were constantly out working during this time. And I learned that song, and I put it into the set list. We learned it, and we started putting it in, and we started getting immediate reaction from the audiences. You know, people coming up and saying, "Oh man, play that song you played, last hour. That what is it, Sugar Shack thing?" And I go, "Okay." And so this started happening almost every night where we were playing. There were requests for the song, and I remember calling Norman from somewhere up there in Iowa or South Dakota, wherever we were at the time, and saying, we got to book a session because I think we might have something here, and told him about the reaction that Sugar Shack was getting. And that's kind of how it came about. And we went back to Clovis at the first convenience time that we had a break in our touring, and we recorded the song, and then Norman took it and shopped it, and it just so happens that Randy Wood was the president of Dot Records at that time, and he loved it, and he signed us to a recording deal to put that song out as Jimmy Gilmer and the Fireballs, and of course it has a history of its own because it almost didn't make it. It became what they thought was a regional hit because when they did press it and put it out, the Texas stations and the New Mexico stations and Colorado and Oklahoma and everything, they all jumped on it, and it went number one almost everywhere, and then started coming back down the charts because nobody else touched it. So we almost lost that record, and that's another story if you want to hear it sometime, how it was saved. But but that's how it came about that Sugar Shack came out of the box. We all along we had been releasing vocal records like on the B side of our instrumentals. They never clicked until Sugar Shack.
Sugar Shack turned out to be the biggest hit of 1963. Were you shocked of the success of that?
Well, no, not after seeing what we went through and saw how it exploded. How fast it went was a shock because it was a fast-moving record, and that was always kind of a surprise and a shock to us. But you understand that it did happen so fast and was coming on so fast. We didn't really have time to analyze anything because next thing you know, we're doing this and doing that and doing this and doing that. So now the fact that it ended up being the biggest record of the year, of course, I'm very grateful for that. And quite honestly, any of those things surprised us.
Well, I'm going to ask you to put on a different hat, and if you would, let's try that again. If you would play disc jockey and introduce Sugar Shack, we're going to play it for our listening audience.
All right. Hey, all of you out there, this is Jimmy Gilmer of the Fireballs, and I want you to pay good attention now to this next record we're going to spin for you. It's called Sugar Shack.
Oh, there's a crazy little shack beyond the tracks, and everybody calls it the Sugar Shack. Well, it's just a coffee house and it's made out of wood. Espresso coffee tastes mighty good. That's not the reason why I've gotta get back up to that Sugar Shack. Whoa, baby, to that Sugar Shack. There's this cute little girlie, she's a working there. Black leotards and her feet are bare. I'm gonna drink a lot of coffee, spend a little cash, Make that girl love me when I put on some trash. You can understand why I've gotta get back to that sugar shack. Whoa, baby, to that sugar shack. Yeah, honey, to that sugar shack. Oh, yes, to that sugar shack. And now that sugar shack queen is married to me, yeah. We just sit around and dream of those old memories. Ah, but one of these days I'm gonna lay down tracks in the direction of that sugar shack. Just me and her, yes, we're gonna go back to that sugar shack. Whoa, oh, to that sugar shack. Yeah, honey, to our sugar shack. Yeah, 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 our sugar shack.
Sounds just as good as it did back in 1963. Sugar Shack, Jimmy Gilmer in the Fireballs. Jimmy is my special guest right now. And do you still have fun singing that, Jim?
Yes, I do. I really enjoy getting out and doing what we're going to be doing there in Uniontown here in a couple of weeks. I wished in fact, I'm making a concentrated effort now to try to do more. What happened when I left the Fireballs in 1970, I got entrenched in the music business in Nashville, Tennessee, and I just I just had another job, and I just turned off the performing altogether. And I got asked many times, to do this play. Could you play here? Could you do it? And I basically turned everybody down, and it ended up hurting me because so many promoters around the country just, don't call him. He doesn't want to work anymore. And a lot of them that carried over for years. But for about the last 20 years, I've been trying to step it up, and my companies, I'm retired for all of them now, and basically all I have now is the opportunity to go out and perform and sing, and I love it, and as long as my voice will hold up, I want to continue doing it.
Okay, going back again to Clovis, New Mexico, you worked hand in hand with Norman Petty. What kind of guy was he? He is probably either the biggest cursed man in the world or the most praised man in the world, or somewhere in between. Well, what's your opinion?
Well, I'm a defender of him. He was like a second father to me. I had the utmost respect for him. Like any situation, there were times when we might locked horns a little bit when he wanted me to do this, and I felt really strong about not doing it. But it was never got out of hand. It was never bitter or anything like that. And in most cases, I always listened to the elder person. But I loved Norman Petty, and he was a genius. He's one of the most gifted music people I ever met, and he had a sense of music that it was God-given, because he couldn't develop it. He could play the organ and the piano and things like this just like he was a concert pianist, and he couldn't read a note of music. It was all, you could just hear it and play it, and so I had a great relationship with him. We as he was our manager, my manager, and the Fireballs manager for, I guess, we were together about 10 years. During that time, we had a contract. There was a time in the contract after about 5 years where an option was up, and the guys, we all got together and we talked about it, because we felt like, because Norman spent he did have an office in New York, but he spent most of his time in Clovis, New Mexico, which is nowhere, where is Clovis? And we always felt like we were missing out, that he needed to be in New York all the time or something. And people are in your ear saying this and saying that, and you can you can take it with a grain of salt, but we all kind of got together and said, I think it's time we do move on, because there were other managers who were inquiring and wanting to know, and promising us this and promising us that and everything. I'll never forget, we all met one night and we sat around, and I think I had to be the spokesman, and I basically proposed to Norman that we were, our contract was up and we weren't signing again. And then for about the next 30, 45 minutes, we sat and listened to Norman talk and give his spiel. And make a long story short, we left there with our tails between our legs, and we signed for another 5 years. Which is in looking back on it, it's the way it should have been. So.
Well, besides the Fireballs and Buddy Holly and the Crickets, did he deal with any other major national bands?
Not really. He had obviously Buddy was the biggest act, and then we came along. But he did a lot of recording though. Any bands came from all over. They came from Canada. They came everywhere to record at his studio. So he was involved in producing sides constantly and shopping them. And not all of them obviously were successful, but it was an outlet for everybody, and that's kind of how he made things work. Now with us, he traveled. Not on the day-to-day road deals, but I know I went to Europe with him several times, and we'd go over there for 4 to 6 weeks and tour and everything. And he was like a road manager and personal manager and doing everything. And we had a great relationship. And I know that there were some bitter people, and I'm not going to mention names or anything, but yeah, he did have there was a side. There were a group of people who thought he was a thief and that he didn't really write those songs with Buddy Holly and this and that. And from my observation, I never saw him steal a dime from anybody, and I never knew him to not be a man of his word. And so I've always tried to, anytime somebody says that or mentions it, I always want to throw in my side of the story, because it's totally opposite.
Well, that's the reason I asked the question, and I appreciate your candor on that. Okay, you had a couple other hits. Daisy Pedal Pickin' went to number 15 in 64, but your other big claim to fame goes back to 1968, Bottle of Wine, which hit number 9 on the charts. Tell us about that.
Well, Bottle of Wine, we had kind of broken up in 65, I guess it was. Not broken up because of conflicts, but George, the guitar player, he had to go do a stint he was a National Guard guy, and he had to go do a 6-month active duty type thing or something. And I remember we just kind of shut down for a while, and it was during that time that I had purchased with Norman an apartment in New York, and I spent a lot of time up there. And this was during the folk craze of the 60s, the early 60s, and I just kind of hung out up there, and I loved folk music, even though I didn't really record a lot of it. I really liked it, and so I just kind of was going back and forth between New Mexico and New York and doing all this kind of stuff. And Tom Paxton, I used to listen to him down in the Village all the time, and he sang this song, Bottle of Wine, every night, and I got to where I knew it. I was like upside down backwards, I knew it. But he did it totally different. He did a bottle of wine, fruit of the vine. It was kind of a swing thing. And anyway, I was messing around, just kind of waiting for George to get back and all that, thinking about music. And during this time, I started playing some folk clubs. And then I remember one night in a little place in Amarillo, Texas, I just started rocking it up, kind of like the way it is now, and just singing a really gravelly voice. And by the way, my voice, I don't know what I've got, a cold. I don't feel like I have a cold, but I feel like I'm gravel voice tonight. But anyway, when we all got back together and we started rehearsing. We had dates on the books and everything. Then again, we went in, got some songs, and this was a song that we added to our set list. And only we arranged it the way you hear it today, with this bottle of wine. And so we went out, and it was the same way as Sugar Shack. We started getting immediate response to it after shows, and so once again, I called Norman and said, "We got to record this one. It's reacting just like Sugar Shack was." And so that's what we did. We went back and we recorded it. There's another whole long story about it. Randy Wood at Dot Records did not want to put it out. He thought it was a drinking song, but he was a nice enough man to let us out of our contract. He said, "If you guys feel that strong about that song, because we still owed him some product. He said, I'll let you out, and good luck to you," which normally would never happen in our music business, but it did with us. And then Norman went and found the guys at Atlantic Records, Jerry Wexler and Ahmet Erdogan, and they fell in love with it, and they put it out, and it was history. It became a big hit again.
Okay, before we introduce that, you're coming to Uniontown 2 weeks from tonight, State Center for the Arts. You'll be here with Randy and the Rainbows, Spider Turner, and the Dovells. And we are looking forward to seeing you. I get to work with you that night because I'm going to be your MC that night. So I'm looking forward to that. And I'm like you now, starting to get a little bit hoarse. But I want to thank you so much for taking the time out of a very hectic schedule, and we're hoping that you're going to be in studio with me on the 13th. We're just waiting to find out what time the show's going to be because of high school basketball. We just don't know what's going on at this point. But we're hoping to see you on Friday before you make it in, and definitely on Saturday. So.
Okay. Sounds good.
Okay, before I let you go, if you play Disc Jockey one more time, and if you would introduce Bottle of Wine, we want to play for our listening audience.
Hey, all you listeners out there, probably my favorite Fireball song ever, Bottle of Wine.
Bottle of wine, fruit of the vine, when you gonna let me get sober? Leave me alone, let me go home. Let me go home and start over. Rambling around this dirty old town, singing for nickels and dimes. Time's getting rough, I ain't got enough to buy me a bottle of wine. Yeah, bottle of wine, fruit of the vine. When you gonna let me get sober? Leave me alone, let me go home. Let me go home and start over. Pain in my head, there's bugs in my bed. Pants are so old that they shine. Out on the street, I beg the people I meet to buy me a bottle of wine. Whoa. Bottle of wine, fruit of the vine. When you gonna let me get sober? Leave me alone, let me go home. Let me go home and start over. Bottle of wine, fruit of the vine. When you gonna let me get sober? Leave me alone, let me go home. Let me go home and start over. Bottle of wine, fruit of the vine. When you gonna let me get sober? Leave me alone, let me go home. Let me go home and start over. Let me go home and start over. Let me go home and start over.
Jimmy Gilmer and the Fireballs, Bottle of Wine. Jimmy will be singing that at the State Center for the Arts Saturday night, February 13th. And we want to thank Jim for taking time to talk with me right now.